And now, it's the Finding Your Spine podcast with host Chase Spears.
Welcome back to the Finding Your Spine podcast, where we call you to live and lead boldly in the truth. What if education can in some way impact one's level of courage? Have we had such a model before? These are some of the questions I'm going to be asking my guest today, Dr. Franklin Annis, a good buddy from years back. Yep. During my time in the Army, one of the few military thinkers that I got to know while I was on active duty. A rare breed to find a philosopher in the ranks. And so it's just really kind of you to come. I appreciate you flying all the way in from D.C. today to come chat it up with me.
Oh, yeah. It was a great honor to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. Let me tell you a little bit about this guy. Dr. Franklin Annis is a military philosopher, historian, educational theorist, and he's also a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. He specializes in Stoic thought and its role in the formation of the U.S. military. You are still yourself an active duty military officer.
Yes.
And philosopher, prolific author. Your most recent book is this one right here. Everyone needs a copy. Marching with Spartans, The Life and Works of Alden Partridge. I have read this cover to cover, have found it incredibly educational. Actually, I referenced some of your work in my dissertation. So cannot highly enough recommend this work. It was very well done, and I'm looking forward to seeing your next volumes on this, because I know this is volume 1, but you've got at least 3 more planned, right?
Correct. So we'll see how far it goes in terms of material we can find. But
I'm excited about reading those. You hold a doctorate in education from North Central University. You hold a Master of Military History degree from the University of Birmingham in the UK. Totally jealous on that, by the way. And are the recipient of the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College Order of the Iron Pen for publications advancing military knowledge and the profession of arms. So what else have you done when you weren't sleeping?
Well, I wasn't sleeping, I guess. Just writing.
Just writing. And also running Evolving Warfighter on X, right?
Yeah, on X. Yeah, YouTube channel, doing my own interviews. I've slowed down a little bit since I've been so heavy on the writing side, but I still try to interview some great thinkers as I find them.
Yeah, well, I've learned a lot from your work, and it's been very helpful to me, both as a scholar, as a military officer, and as a thinker. And so I really appreciate all the time and effort you put into it. It has enhanced my education, and I know you're going to likewise enhance the education of those that we're talking to today. So before we jump in, though, the guy who's been around too many lawyers than me has to throw up a disclaimer so we keep him out of trouble. Dr. Franklin Annis' opinions are his and his alone and are not representative of the U.S. Army, the Department of War, or any other element of the government. So, anyone out there trying to trip him up on that, the disclaimer is out. Move on. Sorry, the PAO in me has to, man.
Appreciate that. Otherwise, I had to say that.
Yeah, right. I try to protect you from it. So, yeah, this is going to be fun, because we were talking before we drove over here about virtuous education. And like, when I first wanted to have you on, I wanted to have you on specifically because you do so much work in Stoicism and Stoic thought, which is, I've realized as I've read, is something that I'm surrounded by in a lot of the literature that I read, but I didn't know that's what it was. But as we were talking, we came to realize there's a lot more ground to cover here in terms of the role that education can play in building courage. So I'm just going to shut up and let you start, man.
Well, some of it is kind of the interest of your podcast, right? So the whole purpose here is talk about like how you find courage, and that really goes back to, have we invested anything into our citizens in terms of focusing them on virtue or explaining what virtue is? And there's been a massive kind of evolution in the American education model, and you could probably argue a devolution in terms of we've had to degrade for what it once was. So if we go way back to the Founding Fathers, Education itself was typically provided by the family itself, usually biblically focused. It brought in a lot of ancient Greek, Roman materials. You might have small town schools, but very tight-knit communities. And one of the major focuses around that time period was making sure that everything that children read was something of beauty or value. So like today, when we teach our children how to read, we might give them a Dr. Seuss book to read, something that we think is entertaining and they might find fun, where in previous generations they would say, no, we need them to read some type of moral guidance as they're reading. So it's more than just them picking up a book and being able to read the material. The material they're reading should be beautiful to help inspire them and make them love reading. And that's mainly why a lot during the founding generations and kind of the generations, a few generations that follows, they focus so much on using the Bible as a text or using some of the Greek and Roman archetypal stories. So everything children were reading a couple hundred years ago brought them to some type of very definitive moral lesson. They were very much founded in philosophy and much higher instructions levels of philosophy. So obviously not all our founding fathers had college degrees. Actually, a very few, just a handful of them had college degrees. Most of them were kind of self-read or self-educated. But they would have had high knowledges of the very different schools of philosophy and the organization of thought. And now we jump into modern times. It's like we have, I would say the majority of college students are graduating without ever taking a single philosophy class. Or maybe if they took a philosophy class, it was a class on critical thinking or how to use logic, but it didn't actually get into how the logic connected to specific schools of philosophy, and then how those schools of philosophy really helped people live their lives. And there's several reasons that we've kind of lost that spirit. You can point back to the German philosopher Hegel. He purposely made philosophy difficult to understand and kind of falsely elevated philosophers in society in terms of that being carried on by kind of the French school like Foucault, where he purposely made philosophy confusing so you had to go to an actual philosopher to get an answer, where previous generations were founding fathers, but it said philosophy is a field of every single man should be well versed in philosophy or how to think. And then there's also the influences of kind of the progressive movement. So kind of the 1880s time period, even though the industrial era really started when America was founded, there was kind of a big push to use kind of industrial thought to stamp out citizens. So American educators looked around the world, and one of the places in the world that had kind of an industrial model of education was Prussia. It's kind of regretful because Prussia really built an education model because they had a battle with Napoleon. They actually lost, and they blamed part of that failure on the creativity of the average foot soldier. So what they wanted to build in their society was aristocrats that were highly educated, very creative, that kind of had private education. But the average foot soldier would be taught obedience. So they designed an education model that focused primarily, above all things, to teach obedience to the state. And then they would teach the basic things, but the aspect of that school was to actually remove creativity among the lower classes of an aristocracy. And that school was very industrial. You came in, you sat down for set periods of time, bells would ring like you were working in a factory. You'd move through various different topics throughout the day. Topics were very split and defined very distinctly different in the ways that you probably wouldn't actually use the information in your real life. So not really a blending of solving problems. But American kind of progressives saw that model and said, hey, we don't have a widespread public education system. It would be great if we imported this model onto America. And then there was a lot of backers financially A lot of the major characters or industrialists in America said, hey, this would really make great factory workers, so we're going to get behind kind of pushing this idea onto America. And as that occurred, you saw kind of a stripping of the older materials that really are related to Renaissance education. So creating a man that was, or a man or a woman that was fully informed, a complete citizen, someone that was creative, that could do everything that they needed to do in life, whether that's grow their own food as a gardener to, making objects that they needed in their lives, to doing higher level intellectual stuff. And we started slicing down people to say, you're just going to be, the mechanic, you're just going to be the baker. And instead of having a person that could be more utilitarian across the spectrum, we started slicing our society into specialists. And it's really unfortunate now today because we really find ourselves in a post-industrial world, but we have an education model that is widespread in America that was really intended to dumb down foot soldiers so that they were perfectly obedient to a king as we sit in the republic. And we no longer have an industrial model. We could go back to a Renaissance mindset where we could have more complete citizens kind of creating and building and doing all these great and wonderful things, but we're kind of stuck in the past with how we've broken education. And it would be very hard to walk away from our current model because just the sheer amount of profitability that we have in our school systems and our jobs that people are employed in terms of making substandard citizens, which is unfortunate.
Yes, like the educational industrial complex.
Correct. Yeah.
I mean, so even in the state of Kansas where I live, when you look at it by a county map, it's a very, very red state. Republicans hold super majorities in both the House and Senate. We have a very, very left-wing governor because we got basically 3 major population centers that elect her. But by county, all 105 counties, and don't get me started on why that's too many counties for a state of 4 million people. It is. But by county, it's very red. But those unified school districts are in every stinking one of those places, right? And they exert such immense power. So yeah, it's amazing to me how many times you'll see a legislator who's knows what the truth is. Yet when the local USD calls, they'll swap votes because of that power. I mean, it's such a hegemonic power, right? Because if you criticize the school district, you're seen as being, you're against the education, you're against children. No, I'm criticizing it because I'm for education, because I'm for children.
Correct. The model that we have to produce educators, like the theories of John Dewey, the progressive, is really still the dominant mindset in terms of like where education begins in America. You could argue Horace Mann really started public education, but Dewey is kind of the most widespread accepted American educational theorist that's taught throughout the 54 states and territories to future teachers. And we'd like to say like, our teachers are politically neutral or they're not biased, but Dewey essentially asserted that one of the purposes of public education was to remove the influence of parents and then to allow the government to insert the moral structure that the government felt was appropriate to children versus allowing that to be determined inside the household, which if you say it out loud, it seems terrifying. And number one, it seems like a conspiracy theorist until you actually go back and read Dewey's work. But if every school that certifies a teacher belongs to that model, it's very hard to introduce anything other than that because the only structures we have set up is to reinforce that one belief, which is rather tragic. So kind of trying to reintroduce the older archetypal material or older educational material back into education really requires either parents to leave to go to private education, Christian education, or you really have to find like exceptional charter schools that will start using more kind of Renaissance type education model. And that's the exception, not the rule.
Mm-hmm. We're right now in this really very different era. Let's just talk about the fact of what happened with Charlie Kirk, right? And like many people, I've been watching a lot more of his content recently than I had before that tragic day there in Utah. And one of the things that I love that he says over and over and over again is courage is a choice. You do not need a skill for courage. You do not need a degree for courage. You do not need an apprenticeship for courage. Courage is a choice. And I agree. I would also add to that knowing who you are, when you are, among whom you are, and from where you come helps give a grounding that is a base to encourage people to make that choice. And so I want to go back. You talked earlier about the founding fathers and how very few of them had a college degree, but they were absolutely educated in every way superior to how most people are educated today because they were raised on the great books.
Correct,
and they were taught logic, and they were taught reason, they were taught mathematics. I mean, they were taught all of the liberal arts. You didn't need a college degree back then. Right now we're in this weird era that I think historians will look back in a couple of years and say those people were really hung up on credentials. And should the Lord tarry 1,000 years from now, historians will say they were absolutely out of their mind over pieces of paper. But and rather than being focused on education, but you look at the founding fathers and those people who left Europe on wind-driven boats and crossed and then stood up to the British Crown, the most powerful military in the world at that point in time. Tremendous courage they had. And they also had a true education.
Yeah, I think some of that's also like we have shifted in our society in terms of what we think the purpose of education is. Like, I think if we did a survey for most Americans and said, what's the purpose of college? The answer would be, I need to get a job.
J-O-B, utilitarian.
If you go back to the founding fathers and say, what's the purpose of a college, which is college is really a collection of scholars, and the purpose of there is to teach complete citizenship, which is something totally different. And that's why you might see, like even today, if someone say, hey, it's okay to go get a degree in philosophy because you're really learning kind of more complete human experience. And from that complete human experience, you'll be able to figure out how to find employment somewhere. But by and large, most people today, and it's a tragedy, right? So if I offered you right now, like I can either give you a Harvard degree, I'll give you the paper that says you're graduated there, or I can let you attend every Harvard class for free and say you have to pick one of the two. Most people will say, hey, I want the degree because the degree is the value. And we've lost track of like what is the actual value out of the education. And it's the challenging of the mind. It's learning new information. And I think the founding fathers, they were definitely introduced to ways of thinking that would challenge our concept today in terms of what the purpose of education is or what the purpose of life. And the great example of this I love the pull out is actually from Thomas Jefferson, right? Declaration of Independence. Like what is the American rights? So right to life, right to liberty, and then the pursuit of happiness. So Jefferson there is actually paraphrasing John Locke, but he changes it. So John Locke, great British philosopher. He was a doctor, did lots of things, political philosophy, education philosophy. But he would say the basic rights of an Englishman are the rights to life, liberty, and property. Like those are the foundational rights of an Englishman. And Jefferson, or when he translates that to our Declaration of Independence, he says it's life, liberty, and it's not about just collecting stuff or maintaining stuff. It's about pursuing happiness, but happiness in the foundational era was defined differently. And he's using a term or a concept that comes from the Greeks and Romans called eudaimonia. And happiness in the Greek concept is the fulfillment of humanity or the search for excellence. So when Jefferson says life, liberty, and happiness, he says life, liberty, and to pursue excellence and fulfill your duty to yourself, your family, to mankind. And it's really to improve yourself. And that's something in terms of focusing our lives that we've totally lost. Because if I went out and asked you, what does it mean to be happy? Most people would say, it's some type of elation or joy or some happy feeling, some surprise, right? Or enjoying entertainment. But the concept of happiness in the foundational era was really trying to push yourself to live in virtue, to fulfill your duties to the community around you, to be a good person. Now, of course, you'd have those great moments that would come along and you'd be kind of euphoric when those things happen. But sometimes happiness is, working outside in the cold and wet because that's what you needed to do to make enough food to feed your family. And I think we've really lost that focus on, like, you can labor and you can have hardships in your life, but those hardships are happiness because it allows you to become a better person or to provide the things that you need to provide back to your community. And if we could return to that aspect, it would truly change America if we could refocus what we thought of happiness.
Yeah, I think this is something that I've begun thinking about more over the last few months, mainly because I get to have these kind of conversations, is the concept of happiness and what does it mean to be happy. And I was talking had one conversation with recently a previous guest, Mike Young. We talked about it also with Josh Bowman, kind of the difference between the Christian work ethic, which is we work because it's part of how we glorify God, because we were given work in Genesis 1 and 2, so pre-fall, and how even in the post-fallen world, work is still a way that God enables us to, serve in the ongoing process of creation and using talents to create and build things and to serve one another. In contrast to kind of the Greek Aristotelian perspective on happiness and work, which is that work is to enable the good life. And I'm not against the good life. Like I have dreams of being able to exchange large amounts of cash for large leisure experiences. Those are all good, and there's nothing wrong with that. But how rare it has been in my life to talk to someone about why do they do what they do, and to hear something along the effect of, because it's what God has talented me with, and I want to glorify Him with it.
Yeah. Which I think you're capturing on. Like, if we talk about the American dream, I think there's been a false assertion in kind of the 1950s forward. It's that house, the white picket fence, it's whatever, the car in the garage, or whatever materialism that we've supplemented. But if we go back kind of to the 1840s and to the American Transcendentalist movement, kind of like the American dream was to really be left alone by the government. So
that's still my dream.
Yeah. So you can go pursue excellence, and then it's really understanding kind of your capacity as a human. Each one of us have our own specific talents, but like Emerson would say, like, you have to accept yourself for your lot, and you have that little tiny plot of ground. So it's your job to kind of plant that garden and grow whatever things you can grow and whatever talents you have. But in doing so, if you kind of pushed yourself for your own individual excellence, you can become more self-reliant. What you can do is you can go into your community and then be kind of a rewarder for virtue. So if you became self-reliant, you did the things that you could do to kind of provide a better life for yourself and your family. If you weren't dependent on others, when you could engage in trade or relationships with others, you could do so because it was a choice, and you could have relationships with other virtuous men, and you could do business with good businesses, but you would have the choice of also saying, I don't need to buy things off of you. So if you're a corrupt man, or I don't like the way you're treating your family, I'm just going to choose not to reward you. So it was an act of kind of self-policing in communities to really pull everyone together and focus more towards virtue. And I think we lost that. And I would love to see kind of the American dream go back to, hey, my dream is to be left alone to the most extent possible, and I'm really there to improve my own education, improve my own livelihood, to build a good home for my wife, my children, to provide, to be productive, to create whatever type of arts that God's given me talents to produce, and to, have good relationships with my neighbors.
I'm thinking now back to the concept of, we talk about parallel economy. So we have the mainstream economy now to where I can't buy an airplane ticket or hardly buy a loaf of bread without knowing, or buy a stock, without knowing that I'm in some way probably giving money to people who want me put in chains, or if not outright put in the ground. And so, there's been a lot of talk about, how do we as sane people, Christians even, and even secular, morally grounded people, how do we build a separate economy where, okay, I can get a phone provider that doesn't hate me, and I can fly on an airline that doesn't hate me, and so on and so forth. But you're saying like that was tradition, part of the earlier American tradition, that economics were about promoting virtue, not just about multiplying how much gold was sitting in the local bank.
Correct. And you see this in actually Adam Smith's kind of Wealth of the Nations, and you see this in Tocqueville when he visited the Americas in the 1830s. He writes it in his Democracy in America. Really, the goal is to have an economy where it's self-interest rightfully understood. So Americans should have the right to go out there, engage in the economy, and make the wealth that they can. But the rightfully understood aspect is like, you shouldn't engage in business that's going to harm your neighbor. So in that regard, we had original checks on greed, and we had ways of kind of focusing our business practices on virtue, or at least understanding like, hey, how much is too much of the pie for individuals to take? Or if you do become the millionaire, then your rightfully understood process there is then you have to become the philanthropist and start taking back care of your community. And somewhere along the line, and I blame it back on that Prussian education model, is, we allowed the state to basically train our children, and then we defaulted some of the duties that especially Christians would associate with themselves, i.e. charity, that we now think, we have social welfare, so I'm no longer responsible for my neighbor because there's X, Y, and Z government program that they could ask for. And it really broke down kind of how we engaged in the economy, because we stopped thinking at a personal level about what our actions are doing in society, and we thought that other mechanisms would go be virtuous for us. But there's only one person that can do virtue, and it's yourself. Like, you can't outsource other people to do virtue for you. And me taking tax money away from you out of your pocket to do good things may make me happy, but it's actually robbing you of your ability to take that same dollar and go do real virtue yourself. So I'm robbing you, and that's kind of the problems with governments, is we think that they'll solve social issues and improve society, where they're actually taking the responsibility off individuals, where it allows us to kind of feign ignorance of the social problems around us and pretend that we're doing good when we don't do any virtue at all.
And then those are the same people who try to tell us governments shouldn't legislate morality, right? Yeah. It's like, well, then don't.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. So let's go back. I'm familiar, just because I'm a Command and General Staff College graduate, that reason, that only, I'm familiar with the Prussian model, most notably is how Frederick the Great raised his army. I'm going to assume most of my listeners probably aren't. So let's tease that out a little bit, because I think I think this is a really strong point. I want to make sure they get it, that I'll throw in my understanding, and then you know way more than I do. So let's break this down. As a friend of mine, as I think a friend of mine recently would say, break it down to me like I'm in fifth grade, which is exactly how I need things broken down to me. But we had Frederick the Great, as the concept of modern nation states are coming about kind of in this post-Westphalian world. And he was really a militarist and wanted a military that literally lived in fear, that men were afraid to turn away from battle lest their comrades would run them through with the spear for cowardice on the charge. And he was known for through this harsh form of leadership, if not outright tyranny, raising very formidable military forces. And so we're kind of applying that to the same mentality with which Dewey, Rockefeller wanted to mold Americans through the educational system. Americans who didn't think, they just responded based on stimuli. Am I
correct.
around the edges here?
So there's a lot of educational scholars that believe that if it wasn't for the Prussian model, like the world wars would not have been possible. So we have actually primed our children to believe that the school teacher is correct, or that the government could call us into service and discipline us in whatever by the millions, where if this big industrial model of public education model didn't exist, they actually don't believe that they could pull enough volunteers or draftees out of countries to force them to go fight in battles like World War I, and especially World War II. Interesting enough, even in American history, when we attempted to start public education, it required the militia to be activated to force parents to give up their children. And we should have woken up at that time and said, this is probably the wrong thing if you're taking children away from their parents at bayonet point, to force them to be raised by someone else intellectually. But there's actually more malicious aspects of the Prussian model that people don't talk about. Is the way they actually got obedience out of the children was not only initially like through physical or corporal punishment, but the Prussian model was also an experiment in kind of social eugenics. So that's one of the reasons why we get grades in school, was to actually teach little girls on how to pick their husbands. So if you could find the most creative, most outspoken and bravest boy, and you could label him as an F student, you could have all the little girls not want to date him. And then would learn how to fall in line so he could find a wife in education. So you could actually punish the people that would most likely rebel against the government. And you could actually train little boys to be docile and obedient to the government through a grading system, because you're teaching the little girls to find who is the most desirable husband based on a grading scale. So if you actually look into the complete model, especially if you look into the original writings of it in the kind of early 19th century, it is a horrific social experiment that we've continued to run, and we, like the people in the know how it was designed. We just continue to run it because we don't tell the general public what we're doing when they run it.
So it was, you're saying the modern like A through F grading scale was a progressive creation to socialize people.
Yeah, social eugenics.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm going in the Wayback Machine in my head here now. I remember when I was an undergraduate, there was this course. I never took it. I don't think my wife took it either. It was in the College of Education at Lee University. It was taught by a wonderful man named Cliff Shimels, who went on to be with the Lord quite some time ago. I loved listening to him speak at chapel. I loved reading his books. I never took a course of his. But there's this one course that I heard about a lot. And you'd go through the entire semester. There are no quizzes, there are no papers, there are no projects, but you read and you come and you listen to the lectures, and your entire course grade is at the very end. You go in one at a time and you do an oral board in front of Dr. Schimmels, and you either pass or you fail. And I remember as a young undergraduate, because I'm socialized to this A through F scale. Now, I was raised as a homeschooler through high school, but I got to college and I've always heard about, you want to keep your grades high. And especially for me, that's how I kept my scholarship. So I was really obsessed with keeping my grades high. And I was terrified of the idea, like I would never take that course. And in years since, as I've started learning about classical education and realizing that what I thought was education really wasn't.
Correct. Yeah.
I've looked back and I've thought, hang on, is that the way we're actually supposed to be doing it?
Correct. Well, there's other aspects of education too. So there's a distinctive difference between what we call andragogy or adult learning theory, even though that term was coined in the 1960s. A lot of the Renaissance education model was really about teaching people as adults. So as soon as a student could learn how to direct their education, you allow them to kind of control their own growth. So an example of that is if you said, hey, I want to come learn mathematics, I would say, okay, how are you going to use mathematics? And you might say, hey, I'm a wheelwright, or I'm an engineer, or I want to be an engineer. So I would help you learn mathematics in the context of how you want to use it. And you could help direct, like, hey, I really need to know how to build a bridge. So when we're working on algebra, it's really about solving problems related to bridge building, et cetera, et cetera. So very tailored education to the individual, and not only in a way that gets after with the intended kind of algebraic information that we're trying to give you, but in a way that's practical or a way that interests the student. So the student actually sees the immediate value. They're more likely to pick up the information because they understand how they can take it out in the world and make it profitable. That is a very old method that was really abandoned by the Prussians, and the Prussians really kind of wrote, you're going to use algebra. I'm going to give you this page of equations, and you're going to sit down and you're just going to go, 1 + 5 is 6, 2 + 2 is 4. I do this with my children now. You sit down and you have a page of just numbers that you're just trying to solve those equations, and it's just page after page after page. Well, none of that information that you've shown mastery of through pedagogy or the way you train children, you can't take any of it and walk into the real world and say, oh, now I know how to build a bridge out of this algebra. Now you just have a list of algebraic equations. And by doing so, like, the student actually loses interest because it's just pages of numbers. And I'm sure you might have experienced this in your college career. Like, you have a math course and you're like, I'm never going to use this anywhere in my life. And the professor's not taking any of the time to show you how, you can use trigonometry to help you with plumbing problems or other associated problems. But the modern system of education we use actually teaches students they hate education because they can't see how to apply it. Where this kind of goes back to the founding fathers. Like, we used to teach education in a way where it used to like expand the capabilities of humans. But again, that Prussian model was really there to primarily teach students to obey the exact commands of teachers, even if they didn't want to do it that way. And it was really there to dumb down students so they knew the basics, but they couldn't take it out and applying it without some other aristocrat that had a private education that then could take those kind of menial laborers and then go build a bridge with them. So it's a shame that in a free republic that we're still using a system where we're really training our future citizens to be peasants.
Yeah, we're training lemmings.
Completes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's horrific. Yeah. All the way around.
And that's how you get some of the people that you see the man on the street interviews with today. Yeah. Like, how many states? 37. Like, okay, come on.
Well, yeah, or even more important, like, how many people understand their constitutional rights, or how many students have actually read the Constitution of the state they're in, much less part of education should be like understanding your roles and your duties, your rights, your privileges as a citizen. All that's been stripped out of most of education, and relates to the gentleman I studied. Captain Alden Partridge would say, hey, if you want to be a free citizen, like, liberal arts used to include the ability to fight, because how can you be a free man if you don't have the knowledge of military arts and science to maintain your freedom? But we've removed that out of education. So now we have citizens that have been dumbed down. They don't know what rights and privileges they have under their constitution. They don't know how their government works, so they can't get into the government positions to change their government. They haven't been trained as militiamen, so they don't know how to defend themselves and their rights. And you really have, unfortunately, an imperial war machine that was built out of this model, where you have huge standing armies, as the founding fathers would have hated. You have overt militarism, where you have the U.S. government asserting its military will across the globe. And all our hippie-loving professors would somehow say, oh, if we teach college students how to use a rifle, or how to be soldiers, then America's going to become more violent. And it's like, well, what's the evidence of that? Like, we've like we've engaged in more major wars after we stopped teaching, the average man to be a soldier than before. So,
well, I think what we're getting at here is two very conflicting worldviews of education. One is the traditional, dare I say, classic form, in which it was built upon creating people who are responsible and can self-govern themselves, because you need to self-govern yourself in order to be able to rightly speak into a republic.
Correct.
Right? Versus this post-Dewey nonsense that we have, in which people are trained to be good citizens based on being molded into this model where they will not stand up. And I kind of think it's when you're rough and tumble world, before things were, we'll use air quotes here, civilized, before paved streets and running water, we'll say, you didn't have time to mess around with a lot of the first world issues that we have today. And now we have this extraordinary luxury that was built on the backs of, strong men. Strong men created good times, and good times have created weak men, as we've seen, and weak men have created bad times. And how do we, I'm trying to think now, like, how do we get back? Because there's this one quote you said to me before we drove over: Dr. Seuss killed America.
Yeah.
Right. And I think now, even listening to my wife read our children the classics, and I learned so much listening to her read the classics, so I can dart out of my office for a little bit. And that stuff is so much richer than a lot of the children's books you pick up today, like Three Little Ducklings Went for a Swim. And where are you getting out of that? Versus when your kids are reading about like David and Goliath, that stirs the soul.
Correct. Yeah. Or even like the Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. There's a simplified version of that book called The American Robinson Crusoe that was the go-to book on teaching young boys to read in America for well over 100 years. It's like, it's got everything you want as a little boy if you want to learn how to read. It's got a man stuck on an island. He's got to learn how to be self-sufficient, right? He has to fight pirates off. Like he conquers a pirate ship to find his way home. He starts his own colony. It's like every little boy's dream. And now we remove that type of material, and then we unfortunately supplemented it with whatever Dr. Seuss or, some story, some generic kids book that we give them that may not even be entertaining. Or even worse, we say, hey, we're only going to gear our reading material towards little girls because we're worried about the success for little girls. And you see a huge crisis in the education of men, because we've really left our little boys behind for the last 20 years in education, and how we've shaped education, because the feminist movement was so worried about the success of little women that we've made women hyper successful, which is wonderful, and we've made little boys that don't want to go to college and just want to stay at home and play video games, that don't want to engage in coursework, that have like no hope for the future. And that's even kind of a worse strategy. Yeah.
Now I'm kind of wondering, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but now I need to read up on this. I'm wondering, like, when did the modern children's book come into being? Because, I mean, C.S. Lewis was not writing them, but he wrote books aimed at young people. And like our founders clearly read things that were written that they could understand as children, but it wasn't these, these eight-page things with, font 18 words.
Well, and this kind of goes, So we'll take it back to even an earlier conversation we had today. So we used to, as Americans, read very complex, long-form material, and we expected that even of our children. So if we went back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the opening statement for the candidates in that presidential election was an hour long, and that would have been written down and sent across the country. Watch presidential debates today, it's maybe 10 minutes at most. When Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense, like the majority, not a big majority, but the majority of Americans could read the complexity of the writing in Common Sense. Now, it's a very small minority of people in the United States are capable of reading the book Common Sense, because the complexity of ideas and how long it takes to fully explain and examine those ideas. And that problem, I think, has accelerated with social media, right? So even now we can say, well, children are reading all the time, even if they're on TikTok or YouTube, they're reading, websites on how to maneuver around. So they have words, they're seeing words, they're processing words. But what we're not doing is we're not processing like singular ideas for long periods of time. And we have nothing in our society that is developing our patience to be able to sit down and say, I'm going to tell you about one specific subject, and my opening comment will be 1 hour long because this comment is so complex. So maybe you might say maybe long form podcast might be one exception to that rule, but the vast majority of Americans are being dumbed down in unimaginable ways just because our attention spans are disappearing and our literacy rates are crashing, and it's all because we're not reading things as complex and we're not asking our mind to understand ideas as fully as what previous generations understood them.
So we've laid out the problem. What's the solution? and I know some of my reading of your work before has talked a lot about the Stoic mindset and
Correct.
and the great stories that come from that are built around courage for the purpose of building courage in men and women.
Yeah, so not to fully dissect Stoic philosophy, but it was a philosophy that focused the goal of life purely on virtue. So the Stoics believe that the only good things in life come out of the virtues. There was no other goal. If you do virtue and bad stuff happens to you, it's fine because you find rewards in doing virtue. They wouldn't have any expectation of any type of moral economy, which means I could be the most virtuous man in the world and I could end up on the streets homeless, and you could be the worst crook in the world and you might end up being a multimillionaire. But ultimately, I'm better off on the streets being a virtuous man than you are in your palace as, the scoundrel you are. The Stoics themselves had several great stories, and we used to have several great stories that we taught in education. You have works like Plutarch that captures the lives of the Romans, the great archetypal stories such as the Aeneas. Used to say like that was the one story that laid out kind of the idea of being a perfect Roman citizen, and that's something that our founding fathers actually really picked up on. Actually, the founding fathers really wanted us to be the Roman Republic before the Marian reforms happened in the military. So they wanted a kind of a militia-based Roman Republic, or what at their time they saw the Swiss Federation having a militia and not being involved in wars. But the one story that actually impacted the founding fathers enough, it's actually a neo-Stoic archetype, which means you take Stoicism and you combine it with Christian theology, and anything that about Stoicism that didn't agree with Christianity, you removed from the philosophy. But it's the story of Cato the Younger, and Cato the Younger was the last Roman senator that stood against the tyrant Julius Caesar and fought to defend the Roman Republic before it crashed under the tyrant Caesar. And there was a play called Cato, a Tragedy, that scholars believe has been played more times in America, second only to the Death of a Salesman, something the founding fathers would have watched, something that George Washington allowed to be performed at Valley Forge to rally his troops. Because ultimately the story ends with Cato actually committing suicide. His forces are destroyed. Caesar basically extends a pardon to Cato, and Cato says, well, you're a tyrant, so there's no way that you have authority to pardon me. And Cato doesn't want to be used as kind of a political puppet, so he kills himself as an act of defiance against the tyrant, kind of ritualistically sacrifices himself for Rome, per se. But that story itself rallied a broken army at Valley Forge for the Americans to say, we're fighting against this tyrant, which is King George, and if we all die in the process, then it's still the right thing to do, because that's how we're going to live. We're going to live for virtue, or we're just going to die. And there's no compromise there.
And even bringing it a little bit closer, I think if I recall reading in here, you making a line between Stoic thought and the Lord of the Rings from Tolkien.
Yeah, so there's a lot of Neoplatonism and Neo-Stoicism that shows up inside Tolkien. So like Aragorn, the concept of kind of the perfect king has all the characteristics of kind of the great Stoic. So he's compassionate, he's a healer, he's very concerned about the citizens of his country. He's, courageous, right? Willing to charge in the first thing, he doesn't hide behind. You see characters like Gandalf. One of the kind of Stoic elements is kind of focusing on the presence, worrying about the things that are inside your control, not worrying things that you can't affect. So you see like Gandalf making quotes like, hey, the only thing is up to us is to figure out what we can do with the time that's given. Like, we're not supposed to worry about what's going to happen to our children or future generations. We shouldn't worry about things that we have no ability to shift and change. You even have actually the first 3 books of the Harry Potter series are actually very heavily Stoic influenced. So you have the virtuous Harry Potter that's willing to break rules because he's trying to fulfill greater virtues as he goes about his challenges in Baltimore. But he's willing to do the right thing and risk his own personal safety and stand up for the good. And it's kind of tragic that the storyline, or at least the philosophy in that storyline, fades towards the end of the book. But there are several very easy stories that we can bring back to the American populace. Robinson Crusoe is a favorite one of mine. I think it's Andrew Weir wrote The Martian, which is an updating of that story. It has a great movie with Matt Damon in it. So where Robinson Crusoe used reason to survive his time alone on an island. In The Martian, he uses science, which is just the modern way of saying reason, to kind of deal with the problems that he's facing one at a time, remaining hopeful and moving forward. And yeah, it's one of those things where I think we really need to return back to kind of those stories, because I think a lot of people understand philosophy more in the story form than kind of raw philosophy, or it's a lot easier for kind of the average man to understand if they have heroes that they can emulate versus kind of just static lists of do's or don'ts.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Well, yeah. I guess one thing, the problem with our generation is like, look at like how many good fathers there are on TV, like. Growing up, it's like we've lost them. Yeah,
they're all buffoons, and they're all forgetful, or they're all drunk, and it's. I remember this was way back in it's 2010, and I remember I was at the captain's career course at Fort Gordon, Georgia, and that was an amazing 5 months, because you go to class, but you're kind of done by mid-afternoon, so you can come home and really kind of process what you learned, being home in time for dinner. I mean, it was just, compared to being on the line, it was a vacation, even though it was a full-time job. And I'll never forget coming home one day. We had Dish at that point in time, so my kids had the Disney Channel. And, they're watching the sitcoms where the dad is the gullible oaf. And I remember one day asking my kids something, and they're like sprawled out on the couch. And they answered me like I was the idiot dad on the Disney Channel. And I was like, this is a life-changing moment. I called Dish, and I paid the $300 early termination fee. I was like, that is an easy bill to pay to regain the souls of my children. And we never looked back. Yeah. Let me ask you philosophy. I teased some of my faculty when I was at Kansas State University finishing up my doctorate. And I said, it's ironic to me that when I finish this program, I'm going to walk across the stage. You're going to put this big fancy hood on me, and I'm going to get a piece of paper that says Doctor of Philosophy underneath my name. And it's going to stoke my ego like mad for about 18 minutes, right? And then I'll come back down to earth. Truth be told, did not stoke my ego nearly that long, but because I was just tired and wanted to go home. And I said, it's not law. I sense a great irony that you're going to give me this thing that says I am a doctor in philosophy. And you're not going to expect me to read a single philosophy text in this program? Does that not seem a little bit off to you?
Yep.
I mean, we've lost that across all of education in America. And I don't know if we lost it or if it was deliberately discarded.
So
Both.
there's a fascinating aspect of, and I always love to compare it, like education now and education 100 years ago. So about 100 years ago, a little more, right? War I happened. So when the U.S. Army declared war, they asked the colleges to shut down early. You know why they asked the colleges to shut down early?
Why?
Because they needed to recruit the professors, because the professors would make perfect officers, because at the time they spoke multiple languages. They were very well disciplined at controlling groups of young men, and all of them at the time would have read all the classics. So they would have read like Julius Caesar's The History of War. They would have read all the great tactical manuals of the Greeks and Romans. They would have understood warfare. But now, if you walk into a college and say, "Oh, I'm going to take the college professors to be officers," like they don't have any like actual practical military knowledge. They're not in shape. You know, they don't know how to control the classrooms. You know, they don't have the foreign language skills that our previous generations had. They certainly aren't experts in the, you know, the ancient warfare, or like how, you know, they haven't read Xenophon. They don't know how to give a great motivational speech. The troops, they don't know the philosophies on like how to survive, you know, privation and difficulty and struggling. And it's just amazing the shifts of education that's happened, even in our lifetime. But when you look back 200 years, it's just tragic to see what we've lost in America.
So what is a step that parents could take, like literally this week, to take a first step in the right direction towards regaining this in their home and the education of their children?
Well, so I think number one is ultimately returning back to some type of form of classical education would be like the ideal model. We really have to get back to the Renaissance models of education. If you find a private school or find a charter school that uses classical education, that would be wonderful for your children. But I would encourage people to take a look at some of the actual original ideas of what education should have been. So, believe it or not, John Locke was not known as a political philosopher at the time of the founding fathers. He was known as an educational philosopher. So he wrote a book or an essay on human understanding that talks about how humans learn. It's a wonderful little book. It's a few hundred pages. You know, pick it up, read through it. Talks about how like education should be a complete construct of education. John Milton also wrote a small pamphlet on education and kind of what education should provide. But I would say at least, at a minimum, start supplementing if you're not financially capable, or if you don't have the time to remove children from public education, start supplementing what the public education is not providing. So start teaching your children, and even some of this is, as parents, you're going to have to learn yourself. Start actually understanding, like, why was the Constitution written? Like, what are the true rights of a citizen? Like, find a copy of your state constitution. Try to find some of the history of what shaped your state constitution. Fitness training would be a huge one for your children. So I'm a soldier, so I'm going to be biased towards military fitness, but get your children into some type of sport that's going to make them uncomfortable, because they have to learn how to be uncomfortable in life. One of the best practices in Stoicism is kind of voluntary exposure to hardship. So one of the things I like to do is go out ruck marching, so carrying a backpack through a heavy backpack long distances, because it forces you, number one, to learn patience under suffering. It teaches you what your body's physically capable of. I don't know if anyone likes David Goggins, but when you think you've run out of everything, you can't push yourself any farther, you're only about 40% of what your body's capable of. And it's amazing what people can do when they start realizing that all the restrictions that we tend to place on ourselves are actually self-restricting. And if we just hold on for one more step, or we go just a little bit further, we can do amazing things. But I think especially the physical aspect, especially repeated exposure, the hardships outside in the cold weather or the rain, we actually get a chance to practice courage in those little ways in our life. And if you're not practiced at like being brave on a daily basis, you're not going to be brave when like a true big moment of your life comes. And and especially as us as parents, is also we have to be the kind of the role models for our children, and which is, we have to demonstrate bravery to our children. And it's a lot of times on the little things, standing up for our beliefs and not walking away from things. And some of that's going to seem hard because I think the cultural zeitgeist for most of our lifetime has been, go along to get along, just kind of brush it off, walk away, don't engage. But, unless people understand that, hey, we're uncomfortable or we don't agree with certain things, unless another viewpoint is put out into the world, then that viewpoint's going to disappear. And I think, especially with recent events, we do have silent majorities inside our country, and it only takes one person to say, hey, I don't believe in this, for the next person over to find their own courage and for that to be spread. And we can honestly kind of share our ideas and not allow tiny minorities of the population to push concepts on all of us.
Yeah, agreed on all. I was, as you were talking about ruck marching, I was remembering in my mind reading your book about how that was a favorite educational method of Captain Partridge, to take young men on long, hard ruck marches and instruct them along the way.
Correct. Yeah, so I loved it because I just went on a long ruck march up in the Black Hills. So I went on the Black Hill Veteran March. They host a 110-mile endurance march. I was traveling with two wonderful gentlemen through that event, but it was wonderful because just like Captain Alden Partridge, we used it basically as a kind of a pedestrian adventure. So as we walked through the Black Hills, we talked about the geography of the Black Hills. There are several like old classic 1880s railroad tunnels we went through. So we had discussions of engineering as we walked through there. We had discussions about what the Army would call coup d'oeil, or at a glance, how land is shaped and kind of how you could use land for military aspects, like where would be areas where you'd have to worry about ambush. If you had to attack on a certain field of battle, how would you do that? So that whole adventure, even though it was kind of a fatiguing, incredibly fatiguing event, it was so much more because we are just constantly looking for new ways to stimulate ourselves and have conversations about everything from philosophy to geology to pointing out different chemicals and rocks as we were marching by. So, you almost can turn everything into a great learning experience if you look for ways of doing it.
Yeah, that sounds fun. I'm hoping it'll work out for me to go do that with you next year. This year, the schedule, I had an event in DC at the same time, but it sounds like a great time.
Yeah.
Sounds way better than most of the other ruck marches that I did on active duty. So cool. Well, where can people find you and follow and learn more?
So I'm most active on LinkedIn, which you can search me by my name. I'm also on Twitter at Evolving War. You can look me up on Facebook as well. And then kind of the primary place where I put out a lot of my research is on YouTube, which is the Evolving Warfighter channel.
Evolving Warfighter channel, where you also talk about this mess for work.
Yes.
Highly recommend if I haven't said it already. I think that makes 4 times now. But no, I really enjoyed it. Well, is there anything else I missed you'd like to make sure we hit real quick?
No, I think we captured almost everything.
Man, this has been fun. I've had you on my list for a long time. So when you called and said, I got plane tickets, I was really, really excited. I knew this would be a lot of fun. And so I appreciate you making the time. Appreciate you flying in. It's taking the time away from your family, especially since you just got back from that march too. Like that was a touch and go, getting home and then coming out here.
Yeah, I hope my wife forgives me.
Yeah. Yeah, inshallah. Yeah, well, I appreciate it, buddy. And, we have been talking about educational theories and how that relates to courage, and how fortuitous, because we're coming to you from a place that's focused on education, the Herzog Foundation Studios in Smithville, Missouri. You should totally check them out at herzogfoundation.com. They do amazing work to catalyze Christian education. If you'd like to know more about me and my other work, you can head on over to chasespears.com. Here on this podcast, we try to bring you stories of courage and resolve to show you it can be done. But it's up to you to put this into practice. It's up to you to find your spine. So get to it. I'm Chase Spears. Thanks for listening.
Remember to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we'll see you next time on Finding Your Spine.